Jungkook has always been shy, too shy to even hold a proper conversation without tripping over his words. His only safe space is his sketchbook, where he can express everything he can't say aloud. His best friend, Yuna, often takes on a protective role, grounding him when his nerves spiral out of control. But when Mr. Kim Taehyung, the new art teacher, walks into his life, Jungkook is doomed. Taehyung is effortlessly charismatic, a man who carries an air of authority without even trying. His deep voice, the way his fingers glide over canvas, the way his piercing gaze lingers just a little too long, it all leaves Jungkook breathless. Jungkook knows it's wrong to feel this way. Taehyung is his teacher, and he's just a trembling mess of nerves who can't even hold a brush properly when Taehyung is near. But the heart has never followed rules. And one evening, when Taehyung asks him to stay after class, Jungkook's walls collapse. His anxiety reaches a breaking point, panic overwhelming him, and before he knows it, he's trembling in his teacher's arms, seeking the warmth and comfort he's been deprived of for so long. And Taehyung, despite every moral line he should not cross, can't bring himself to push him away. Jungkook's fingers trembled around his pencil, the soft scratch of lead against paper barely masking the pounding of his heart. The art room was quiet now, save for the occasional flicker of candlelight from the window where the storm outside raged on. He knew he should move, should pack up his things and go home, but he couldn't. Not when he was still here. Mr. Kim Taehyung. Jungkook had spent countless hours studying the man in stolen glances, how his sharp jaw softened when he smiled, how his long fingers expertly guided a paintbrush, how his deep voice sent shivers down Jungkook's spine with every critique. But admiration was one thing. Being alone with him was another. "You're tense," Taehyung's voice pulled him back to reality. Jungkook flinched, nearly dropping his pencil. "Sorry," a warm chuckle. "Breathe, Jungkook." Jungkook sucked in a sharp breath, but it only made his chest tighten more. His anxiety was creeping up his spine, a familiar sensation of suffocation wrapping around him. He couldn't do this. He couldn't be alone with Taehyung, not when his heart was betraying him, not when, "Stay after class," the words shattered him. His breath hitched. "No, no, no. I can't, I have to, Jungkook." Taehyung's voice was softer now, a quiet authority beneath it. Just for a few minutes, Jungkook's mind spiraled. The air in the room seemed thinner, his fingers felt numb, and before he could stop himself, his vision blurred. Panic wrapped around his throat, and his body reacted before his mind could catch up. The next thing he knew, he was sinking, falling into the warmth of Taehyung's arms. Hey, breathe," Taehyung murmured, voice now urgent. "It's okay, I've got you." Jungkook didn't realize he was clutching onto Taehyung's shirt until he felt the slow rise and fall of the man's chest. His hands were shaking, but Taehyung's grip on him was steady, firm. He smelled like paint and something deep and musky, something grounding. "I don't know why, you don't have to explain." The softness in Taehyung's voice made something inside Jungkook break. He had spent so long being fragile, being a mess, being too much, but Taehyung didn't pull away. Instead, a warm hand gusted over his back, grounding him in a way no one ever had before. "Let me take you home." Jungkook should say no, should push away, should run. But for once in his life, he didn't want to. Jungkook barely registered how Taehyung led him out of the art room. His feet moved on instinct, his mind still dazed from the remnants of his panic attack. The cold night air hit his flushed skin, a sharp contrast to the warmth of Taehyung's hand on his back as he guided him toward the parking lot. "I shouldn't." Jungkook's voice came out weak, breathless. "You're not in a state to go home alone," Taehyung interrupted gently, unlocking his car. "Get in." Jungkook hesitated, but when he looked up, Taehyung's gaze was firm yet patient, like he was giving him the choice rather than forcing him. Still, there was something about the way he spoke, calm, steady, authoritative, that made Jungkook obey without thinking. He slipped into the passenger seat, fingers gripping his backpack tightly as Taehyung shut the door behind him. The warmth of the car was almost suffocating after the chilly night, and Jungkook curled in on himself, making himself as small as possible. The silence stretched between them as Taehyung started the engine. A slow, quiet hum filled the space, the streetlights casting fleeting shadows over his sharp features. Jungkook sneaked a glance, swallowing hard. He's too close. Too big. Too intense. Taehyung's deep voice broke through his thoughts. Jungkook flinched. A small hum. "Seatbelt, Jungkook." His face burned. He fumbled with the buckle, hands still trembling from earlier. After a few failed attempts, the click finally echoed through the car, and Jungkook exhaled shakily. Taehyung's eyes lingered on him for a second longer before he pulled out of the parking lot. The drive was quiet. The city lights blurred past in golden streaks, and Jungkook tried to focus on anything but the way his heart pounded in his chest. He felt exposed. Like Taehyung had seen too much. "Does this happen often?" Jungkook's fingers tensed around his hoodie sleeve. He bit his lip, debating whether to lie, but something about the way Taehyung asked, like he genuinely wanted to know, made him exhale in defeat. "Sometimes." Taehyung nodded, as if he expected that answer. He didn't press further, but his fingers tightened slightly around the steering wheel. Minutes passed before Taehyung finally spoke again. "Do you have someone at home?" Jungkook shook his head. "Just me." Taehyung glanced at him. "Your parents, they travel a lot," Jungkook murmured. "I don't really see them much." Taehyung's jaw tensed, but he didn't say anything. Jungkook was grateful for that. He didn't need pity. The rest of the ride was silent, but not uncomfortable. Taehyung's presence, despite everything, was strangely grounding. Jungkook's breathing had evened out by the time they pulled up in front of his apartment complex. The car idled, the engine humming softly between them. Jungkook hesitated, fingers curling around his backpack straps. "Thank you for this." Taehyung turned to him then, eyes searching his face. "You don't have to thank me." Jungkook swallowed. The way Taehyung looked at him, it was unreadable, dark but not unkind. "You should get some rest," Taehyung murmured. And Jungkook shivered. A pause. Then, "Don't be afraid to ask for help." Jungkook's breath caught. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, so he only nodded, hurriedly unbuckling his seatbelt and scrambling out of the car before his emotions betrayed him again. As he rushed inside, he didn't dare look back. Because if he did, he'd see Taehyung still watching him, fingers curled around the steering wheel in restraint. Jungkook barely slept that night. Even with the comfort of his blanket wrapped around him, his mind refused to quiet down. His heart still pounded from the way Taehyung had looked at him, steady, unreadable, yet somehow so warm. And his words, "Don't be afraid to ask for help." Jungkook wasn't sure why that simple sentence had unraveled him. Maybe because no one had ever said it to him before. By morning, his body was sluggish, and dark circles painted beneath his eyes. But he forced himself up, got ready, and slipped into the familiar routine of his day. Except today wasn't like any other. Because today, he had to walk into that art class and face the man who had seen him at his most vulnerable. Jungkook gripped the strap of his backpack tightly as he entered the classroom, keeping his head low. Students were already chatting in their usual groups, some setting up their canvases, others scrolling through their phones. But his eyes found him immediately. Taehyung was at the front of the room, adjusting some materials on the desk. He was dressed in a loose button-up today, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, exposing strong forearms dusted with paint smudges. His dark brown hair was styled effortlessly, as if he had run his fingers through it absent-mindedly. Jungkook swallowed thickly and quickly turned away. He sat down at his usual spot by the window, pulling out his sketchbook. If he just acted normal, maybe Taehyung wouldn't. Jungkook, his breath caught. Slowly, hesitantly, he lifted his head. Taehyung was standing right beside his desk. Close. Too close. Jungkook's fingers tightened around his pencil, his body stiffening. Yes, Taehyung studied him for a moment before his lips parted, voice low and smooth. Come see me after class. Jungkook felt his pulse stutter. He couldn't help it, his mind instantly flashed back to last night, to the warmth of Taehyung's arms, to the firm but gentle way he had held him through his panic. Panic curled in his stomach again, but before he could overthink, Taehyung spoke again, tone softer this time. Just for a moment, and then, as quickly as he appeared, Taehyung walked away, resuming his lesson as if nothing had happened. Jungkook barely heard a word throughout class. When the last student had packed up and left, Jungkook remained frozen in his seat. He could still make a run for it. Taehyung wouldn't chase him, right? But then, I won't bite, you know. Jungkook flinched, looking up just as Taehyung leaned against the desk, arms crossed loosely over his chest. The smirk in his voice was subtle, but the amusement in his eyes was clear. Jungkook's cheeks burned. I wasn't, he swallowed, shutting his mouth before he could embarrass himself further. Taehyung sighed, his expression softening. Relax, easy for him to say. Still, Jungkook forced himself to stand, shuffling over until he was just a few feet away. Close enough that he could smell the faint scent of paint and cologne on Taehyung's skin. Taehyung studied him carefully. Then, you didn't sleep well, did you? Jungkook stiffened. You look tired, Jungkook cursed inwardly. Of course you would notice. He shifted awkwardly, lowering his gaze. I was just thinking a lot, Taehyung hummed. About what? Jungkook hesitated. But then he forced himself to take a small breath. Last night, Taehyung didn't react immediately, but something flickered in his eyes. I see. Jungkook bit his lip, his voice quieter this time. Why did you help me? Taehyung tilted his head slightly. Did you want me to leave you there? No. Jungkook exhaled shakily. I wasn't expecting it. Taehyung held his gaze, unreadable. You remind me of someone. Jungkook blinked. What? For the first time, Taehyung looked almost hesitant. His fingers drummed lightly against the desk before he let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. Never mind, he murmured. Jungkook frowned but didn't push. Instead, he found himself staring again at the sharp lines of Taehyung's jaw, the way his throat bobbed slightly as he swallowed. And then, Taehyung's eyes dropped to his lips. Jungkook's breath caught. It was brief, so brief that he almost convinced himself he imagined it. But he knew he hadn't. He saw it. Felt it. A slow, subtle shift in the air. And Jungkook knew then, this was dangerous. But God help him. He didn't want to stop. Jungkook should have walked away. He should have ignored the way his heart slammed against his ribs, the way his breath came in short, uneven gasps. But with Taehyung standing so close, his dark eyes locked onto his, escape was impossible. It was silent, too silent. The air between them was thick, weighted with something neither of them dared name. But then Taehyung shifted, his voice dropping to something dangerously soft. "You're trembling," Jungkook swallowed. "I am not." A small smirk twisted Taehyung's lips, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Lying doesn't suit you." Jungkook felt exposed. Like Taehyung could see through every fragile part of him, unraveling him thread by thread. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, desperate to hold on to something, anything, that could ground him. "I should go," Jungkook whispered, though even as he said it, he didn't move. Taehyung tilted his head, watching him. "And then, do you want to?" Jungkook froze. His pulse roared in his ears. His body betrayed him, his feet refusing to take that single step back. He should have said yes. But instead, no. It was barely a breath, a confession so quiet he wasn't even sure if he had truly spoken it. But Taehyung heard him. And something in his gaze shifted. There was restraint there, so much restraint that Jungkook swore he could feel it, could sense the way Taehyung fought to keep himself still, to keep himself in control. But his fingers twitched. And Jungkook? He was already falling. Taehyung's hand moved first, slow and deliberate, fingers grazing along the curve of Jungkook's jaw. It was barely a touch, but it burned, hot and all-consuming, searing into his skin like a brand. Jungkook shuddered. "Mr. Kim Young." Jungkook's breath hitched. He looked up then, into the endless depths of Taehyung's eyes, and that was his undoing. Because Taehyung wasn't just looking at him. He was devouring him. Jungkook barely had time to process it before Taehyung leaned in, his lips brushing just barely against his own. It wasn't not yet. It was a warning. A promise. A silent question. Jungkook's entire body trembled. His hands hovered in the air before they found purchase against Taehyung's chest, his fingers curling into the soft fabric of his shirt. This was wrong. But God, it felt right. "Tell me to stop," Taehyung murmured, his breath warm against Jungkook's lips. Jungkook couldn't. Didn't want to. Instead, he exhaled, his eyes fluttering shut. And that was all it took. Taehyung's lips finally crashed into his, the tension snapping like a rubber band pulled too tight for too long. It wasn't gentle, it was raw, desperate, a collision of pent-up restraint and unspoken desire. Jungkook gasped into his fingers tightening their grip, his knees going weak. But Taehyung was there, a steady presence, a solid force against him, his hands now splayed firmly against Jungkook's waist, holding him close, as if letting go wasn't an option. And maybe it wasn't. Maybe it had never been. Jungkook whimpered when Taehyung deepened the his lips moving with an expertise that sent sparks down his spine. But then, a sudden knock at the door. Both of them froze. Reality came crashing back like a tidal wave, the weight of it suffocating. Taehyung pulled away first, his breath ragged, his hands still gripping Jungkook as if he couldn't bear to let go. But his eyes screamed regret. Jungkook. Jungkook barely registered the way Taehyung whispered his name. Because he already knew. This was the end. The line had been crossed, the moment shattered. And when Taehyung finally stepped back, putting distance between them, Jungkook felt it, the loss, the ache, the goodbye that neither of them could say. But it was already written in the space between them. Because some desires were never meant to be touched. And Jungkook? He had just burned himself on the most forbidden of flames.